Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important is that Zelensky decided to arrive in Kharkiv and to start operating the situation by himself. He realized that if you want to have everything to be done well, you need to do this by yourself. Zelensky arrived in Kharkiv and he made the meeting of the officers in the general direction. He received a lot of reports from different soldiers and officers on the ground. Most likely he didn't understand anything what they were talking, what was they saying, but anyway, regarding the situation, he made a conclusion, and according to him, Zelensky said that all we, it's like Ukrainians, are two Patriot systems. Russia will not be able to occupy Kharkiv if we have them. So this is the conclusion the Ukrainians made on the reports and the situation on the ground in the vicinity of Liptsi and Vovchansk. We can understand Zelensky because, for example, today we got another video how the Russians managed to discover the ammo depot and the concentration of special forces of Ukraine to the south of Kharkiv, and as a result of this counter-strike, that concentration of forces was destroyed. Then we see that there is a secondary detonation. Currently, we don't know for sure the real losses that armed forces of Ukraine suffered as a result of the strike, but the sources on the ground are saying that significant losses the Russians managed to deal as a result of this attack. Now let's move to the line of combat contact. Today we are not going to start with Liptsi. Today we are going to talk again about the Udi direction, this one, because today we got additional activization from the Ukrainian side. On this video, for example, we can see how the Ukrainians were bombing the concentration of Russian forces along the border with multiple launch rocket systems. It's very, let's say, interesting situation that is taking place with the Ukrainian artillery systems. The average life cycle of any artillery system that Ukrainians use on this direction probably less than a day, maybe even less than 12 hours. For example, just minutes ago, let's say a few seconds ago, we were watching how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian forces with multiple launch rocket system, and the same day we got another video how the Russians managed to discover that multiple launch rocket system and destroy. So basically the situation is that Ukrainians can't bring let's say armored vehicles and artillery systems very close to the line of combat contact. Everything that goes from the south to the north can be discovered by the Russians and destroyed in a minute. Anyway, despite the losses, we see Ukraine activization. We see that the main clashes are taking place here in Liptsi, but for some reason the Ukrainians are attacking the Russians here. And once again, as we discussed in the previous updates, the main Russian goal on this stage of the special military operation is to create a buffer zone. And the Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod from few settlements. The Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod from Udi, the Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod from Lopoň, the Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod from Liptsi, and also, if you remember, from Liptsi, the Ukrainians brought down the airplane with the prisoners of war, and the Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod from Vovchansk. At least 2 towns of 4 were already by the Russians stabilized. It's Vovchansk and Liptsi, but there are still two more, Udi and Lopoň, that Ukrainians still can use for attacking on direction of Belgorod. The question is why the Russians haven't started their offensive operation on this direction is a very big question. The thing is that maybe the Russians are trying to save reserves and reinforcements as long as possible, because the Russians still don't know for sure from their side how the battle for the Liptsi and how the battle for Vovchansk is going to finish. So that's why they don't want to waste their resources for nothing. They want to keep them, and after the end of this phase, maybe the Russians will launch an offensive on this direction as well. Now let's move to Liptsi. We got significant number of geolocations and updates, and the most important is coming from this territory. As you can see, we have adjusted the map between the villages by the name of Gluboka, Kupiansk and Liptsi itself. These forests, and these forests are already under Russian control. Furthermore, if we zoom in better, we're going to see that the Russians captured the first buildings, the first constructions on the eastern flank, on the eastern side of the village of Liptsi itself. We have geolocations confirming this. The geolocations were published by the Ukrainians. On this video, we can see a group of Russian forces, and on this video, we can see Liptsi itself, and we see how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russians. So once again, we have 100% geolocated confirmation that the Russians entered Liptsi not just from the north through this residential area, but also the Russians entered Liptsi from the east, and the official battle for Liptsi has started according to the locations on the 16th of May of 2024. What is Liptsi and what the Russians are trying to do? If you take a look at this area deeper, we're going to see a river Kharkiv. This is river Kharkiv that basically split the territory in two parts, and if we analyze the situation, we're going to understand that the focal point of Liptsi is this part, the area where the main roads are coming all together from the south to the north. And if the Russians are able to block this road, to block this area, then the northern part will collapse automatically. Furthermore, the Russians will be able to move further even to the west in direction of Male Prokhody, Veliki Prokhody, and many other directions. Anyway, the Russians just need to get as close as possible to this yellow area and to block this area from any direction, from the north, from the west, or from the east, or from the south. And if they do this, the northern part will collapse automatically, and basically on this direction the Russians will complete the battle for Liptsi. But there is one important thing that we also start receiving from the Ukrainian side: significant number of FPV drone strikes. If you remember, when the Russian offensive just started, the Ukrainians were publishing the videos of just 42nd Mechanized Brigade, of how the 42nd Mechanized Brigade was attacking the Russians. And now on the 16th of May, we start receiving the videos of FPV drone strikes on Russian positions from at least 4 or 5 different FPV drone operator squads, which confirms that by the 16th of May, the Ukrainians managed to redeploy already some forces, some reinforcements and reserves to Kharkiv, and now nothing is going to be so smoothly for the Russians as it used to be during the previous 5 days. At least now I have one answer to the questions why the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukraine energy facilities all over the entire Ukraine. One of the main purposes of those attacks was to destroy the Ukraine energy facilities, of course, and to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities of redeployment forces from one side of Ukraine to another. So probably that was also a reason of Russian massive attack on the energy infrastructures. Now let's move. Let's talk a little bit about the area. During the previous 24 hours, we got some videos of how the Russians were hunting the multiple launch rocket systems, and this is probably one of the important sides, one of the important things, something that make this direction differ from other directions, is that during the previous, let's say, since the beginning of Russian offensive, the Ukrainians lost few tens of multiple launch rocket systems as a result of Lancet strikes. If we increase the numbers of updates, just imagine the numbers of skulls on the map and drones far from the line of combat contact are the strikes on Ukrainian artillery system. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses just during the previous 1 week of clashes on Kharkiv direction. Now let's move to Vovchansk. We also got additional updates. If you remember, we had some doubts about the Russian control over the village by the name of Staritsa. A lot of mappers have already adjusted their maps showing this territory and the complete Russian control, but today the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were counterattacking the Russian forces, and that Ukrainians basically by this video shown us that the Ukrainians still have control over the village by the name of Staritsa, and that this territory under their control. Furthermore, we still haven't received any geolocations or any updates or any reports from the Ministry of Defense about control over the village, so most likely Staritsa, at least some part of the village, still remains under Ukrainians. Now let's move to Vovchansk. We have a lot of updates. Let's start from the northern part. Let's start from the eastern flank. According to different mappers, the Russians start pushing towards this village and from the east as well. And as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to capture the first buildings and the first streets on the eastern flank of the northern Chasiv Yar, northern Vovchansk, and they're planning to move further to the central part. So this territory now is also one of the main target of the Russians. When talking about the southern part, we have the video confirming the Russian progress and that the Russians captured the hospital, this one. On this video, we can see the Russian infantry and the Russian soldiers who were clearing this hospital, which confirms complete Russian control. The most important that now we can say that the distance between the Russian edge geolocated Russian positions and the bridge is less than 300 meters, so that's less than 250 meters. And this video, by the way, was published today at noon time. So most likely by the end of, before I start making this video, by the time I start making the video, most likely the Russians establish complete control over this part of Vovchansk, which means that complete collapse of the Ukraine defense belt, and currently the main clashes in Vovchansk are getting closer and closer in the area of Vovchansky industrial zone aggregatny plant, this one. So this is the main area of clashes right now, and so this is the story. So the battle for the northern part is about to be finished, and most likely the battle for the northern part will be finished before the end of this weekend. We have some videos of fire anomalies in the high-rise area, high-rise building area, which also confirms the active phase of clashes on this direction. The Russians, as a result of clashes, either Russians or Ukrainians set the building on fire. And we have the video confirming the Russian progress in the eastern part of Vovchansk as well. On this video, we can see the Ukrainian FPV drones who were FPV droning the Russian forces and this part. So the battle once again is about to be finished, at least for the northern part. And we start receiving the first videos of Russian soldiers with the flag. On this video, we can see the Russians on the entrance of to the village of Vovchansk. But for now, it's not like the central part, so it's not like the evidence of complete control, of course. And anyway, even if the Russians, and not even when the Russians establish complete over the northern part, the biggest and the main question, how the Russians are planning to move further to the south, how the Russians are planning to handle with the central and the southern Vovchansk. The Ukrainians from their side continue sending additional reinforcements and reserves from the mainland. The Ukrainians don't have lots of options. They're using their roads that is under complete Russian control. And just during the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources published significant number of videos confirming that most of the armored vehicles that were used by the Ukrainians were destroyed as a result of Lancet strike, as a result of artillery strikes. The Ukrainians suffered significant, let's say, losses. And this is, of course, a very big problem because from one side, they still have some reserves and they keep some forces, but they can't bring, let's say, armored vehicles and tanks because the sky, the Russians established complete dominance and complete superiority with drones, and the only thing the Ukrainians can do is to fall back slowly, step by step. Armored vehicles, everything that goes to Vovchansk, stay in Vovchansk forever. So this is the situation. On this video, for example, we can see now the Ukrainian T-72 tank that was destroyed as a result of Lancet strike. And once again, if we increase the numbers of updates, at least, let's say, since the 10th of May, when the, let's say, the Russian active phase of offensive operation started, we see significant number of armored vehicles that were destroyed on the direction. Maybe up to 20 armored vehicles were destroyed all over the line of combat contact, all over the Vovchansk front line. Now let's move further to, let's say, northern Kupiansk direction, where we also got lots of updates. The Russians, after a very short operational pause, renewed their offensive towards Berestove. If you remember, just yesterday we were talking that, according to some sources, the Russians managed to break through the Ukraine defense belt and that the Russians captured the first street in the village. But yesterday we haven't received any geolocations confirming this. Today the Ukrainian sources published the video, more precisely the forces of 110th Brigade published the video of how they were FPV droning the abandoned Russian tank on the way to Berestove. The tank was abandoned. We see no losses among the Russian personnel, so most likely there was a landing operation, and after the landing operation the Russian infantry started moving further to the south and the abandoned armored vehicles were destroyed by the Ukrainians. For now we are not changing the color of Berestove, we need more evidence, and the most important thing that it's really unknown where exactly the Russians are planning to move further, because some sources right before we start making the video start posting updates that the Russians are from Berestove trying to bypassing Berestove, we're moving further to Pishane from this direction. So I have some doubts. Maybe the Russians don't have any plans to capture Berestove. Maybe the Russians are just trying to bypass, to cut the road between Berestove and Pishane, and then to move further to the north in direction of Pishane from the southwestern direction. So for now it's unknown, and this area is completely covered with the fog of war. But most likely tomorrow, before the next update, we're gonna receive additional details. Northern Kupiansk, northern, let's say, Donetsk direction, Siversk area, nothing special, just regular artillery duels, regular strikes from the Russian forces. The Russians reducing till ruins, Sporne, but without any changes on the ground. So on Siversk direction, we see the same picture as we used to see, as we saw yesterday, the day before yesterday, months ago, 2 months ago, and half a year ago. Just a heavy artillery activization from the Russian side, aviation strikes, but without any attempts to improve their positions on the ground. Chasiv Yar, we have lots of updates, lots of strikes, the work of Russian aviation, helicopters, everything is working, everything is attacking Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian positions. The situation is very difficult. According to Budanov, the Ukrainians have their armies in two places. One part of army is located in Chasiv Yar, the second one in Kharkiv, and the Russians are reducing these two armies as much as possible. A few more, let's say, light vehicles, trucks, vans were destroyed as a result of strikes, and the most important, that we start receiving more and more updates from the area of Kalinovka, which confirms that most likely currently the Russians are clearing Lisova Street. For now, we haven't received any geolocations confirming additional Russian progress on the ground, but we see geolocations of destroyed at least vehicles from the Ukrainian side. And the Russians start clearing their passage, their movements to the eastern Chasiv Yar from Stupki-Golubkovsky forest, which confirms that most likely this part of the forest is also under the Russians. On this video, we can see the armored vehicle or personnel carrier that was abandoned by the Ukrainians. And after that, that personnel carrier was destroyed as a result of a few FPV drone strikes from the Russian side. We remember that a few days ago, the Russians entered Chasiv Yar with a turtle tank. For now, the destiny of that turtle tank and the situation in the eastern block of Chasiv Yar is unknown. Klishchevka, we see that the focus is moving further to the south and the, let's say, west, for now without any updates whether the Russians managed to move further and to capture additional territory. The only thing we can see is that the Russians are moving focus. Currently, we start receiving any updates from the central part as well as from the northern part. The main updates are coming from the southern part, which we can use probably as some evidence that the Russians are pushing and the Ukrainians are leaving their positions. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area, to Chiretina. If you remember, we discussed that the Russians changed their state. Currently, they are digging in deeper, trying to prepare the foothold before possible Ukrainian counterattacks, and the Ukrainians started their, let's say, local counteroffensive operation. They're not so, let's say, big as the Russians attacked the Ukrainians, but on some front lines, the Ukrainians are counterattacking, trying to force the Russians to fall back. And at least on the line between the village by the name of Sokol and Solovyova, the Ukrainians managed to get some results and to force the Russians to fall back. This morning, first we got report that Ukrainians restored control over these trenches, over this rich network of fortifications, and later we got the video of how Ukrainian Bradley of 47th, let's say, mechanized brigade was attacking the Russian forces and the Russian positions from a very close distance, and this video confirmed that Ukrainians managed to get as close as possible to the village by the name of Solovyova. And the Ukrainians will continue their counterattacks because they understand that the situation in the southern, let's say, towns is very difficult, so that's why they need to stretch the Russian reinforcements, reserves, and to take some fire on themselves. The Russians continue bombing Novosylovka Persha, preparing the foothold before further storm assault operation. The Russians are about to finish some battles for some towns on this direction, like Umanska, Nivolska, like Netailove, and after the Russians capture all these settlements, of course, they will change their focus back to the north, and they will continue with these villages like Sokol, Voshod, Yevgenievka, Novopokrovska, and so on. So let's move to Umanska. As we discussed, according to different mappers, Umanska is from 90 to 100% is under complete Russian control. We have updates that the Russians are getting closer to Yasnobrodovka, and right before I start making the video, we got reports that the Russians captured Netailove completely and that Ukrainians abandoned the village completely to Karlovka and to the south in direction of Nivoyska. For now, the Russians are digging in deeper. The Russians are trying to, let's say, to demine the area, to clear the fortifications, to clear the farms, to clear the area area in the vicinity of Vadiana, but once again, most likely the Russians capture the village, and most likely tomorrow or the day after, the Ministry of Defense will will include this information into their daily report. Krasnogorovka. After, let's say, the Russians captured the eastern flank fortifications and this industrial zone they stopped, now the Russians are focused on the Ukrainian high-rise building area. The Russians are bombing the next Ukrainian defense belt, not the next, but probably the final defense belt in Krasnogorovka, because after this defense belt collapse, then there's just behind this area just low-rise area with small buildings, which is not a very big problem for the Russians. Most likely the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back, otherwise they will be, I don't know, FPV droned by the Russians or something like this. So from the other side, this video confirms the line of combat contact and confirms where exactly the Ukrainians' positions currently located. This is the high-rise area and the final defense belt of Ukrainians on Krasnogorovka direction. Umanska, Georgievka, we haven't received anything. Krasnogorov, Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka, nothing as well. Ugledar, also complete silence, as well as South Donetsk direction, Velika Novoselovka. Just few FPV drone strikes, just few FAP arrived, nothing special. Robotyne, during the previous days we had lots of talks and lots of, let's say, conflicts between different experts whether Robotyne fell or not, and today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation published us the final confirmation that the Russians established and raised the flag in the most northern part of the village, here where the flag was established. So once again, Robotyne has fallen completely. The Russians established complete control, and now the Russians are moving further to the fields, trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back further to the north in direction of Novodanilovka. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. We haven't received almost nothing from the Dnipro river, but we got a very interesting video from Netailove. On this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover the warehouse with Ukrainian Navy drones, and the drones, very big warehouse as you can see. The Russians were following this area for a very long time, and then they made a strike, and as a result of the strike the Ukrainians lost significant number of drones. And the Russians probably knew that Ukrainians were planning to start attacks on Crimea, because today the Ukrainians, during the previous days, not just today, the Ukrainians conducted massive drone and missile strikes all over the entire Crimea. There was the videos from Belbek airfield that were reported that the Russians lost 2 MiG-31 and 1 S-400 air defense system, and after this success the Ukrainians decided to attack Crimea with Navy drones, but most of the Navy drones were discovered by the Russian helicopters and by the Russian reconnaissance service, and as a result of helicopters attacks those drones were destroyed. The question I have, why the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians Crimea during the daylight, during that's when everything is easy to see, when helicopters no needs to have with special equipment to discover the drones, you can't just see them on the surface of the sea without any problems. Very big question. Maybe the Ukrainians were trying to discover the Russian airfields, or how the Russians are going to react, because maybe this night they're going to make more attempts to attack Crimea, and the most important, Crimea bridge as well. So this is the situation on the ground. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.